If you're new here, I'm glad that you're here this morning. My name is Zach, and if you are new, my primary responsibility is to be the worship leader with our worship team today. Didn't they do a great job this morning? Can you give them? So if you've been here before, you have probably noticed and seen me up on the drum set quite often. This is because the drums are my primary instrument. My dad was a really good drummer. He played in some orchestras. He played almost every Sunday at church growing up. And so I grew up with a drum set in the basement. So from a young age, look at that cute guy. I wanted to learn how to play the drums. That's 2004. So I would have been 9. So around 8 or 9 years old, I said, Dad, I want to learn how to play the drums. Teach me what to do. And so I remember my first lesson vividly. And you'll see from some of these other pictures that I look kind of awkward. I'll be holding sticks, and I don't quite know what to touch. I don't know what to do. And my dad sat me down. He said, okay, I'm going to show you the beginning steps to play the drums. So the way he did it is he sat me in the seat, and he literally said, put your foot here, put your left foot here. He would grab my arms, showed me how to hold sticks, and he would actually move my arms for me at first. And so you can see there's some awkwardness. I'm figuring it out. I don't quite know what I'm doing. And if you were paying attention to Joffrey this morning on the drums, you'll know that you literally use all 4 limbs when you play drums. So I needed my dad to say, here's what you do with your left foot, with your right foot, and with your hands. My dad was a huge influence on me as a drummer. I would watch him play at church. I would listen to him when he was in the basement. And as time went on, the way that I learned to play the drums was by listening to CDs. I was a 90s kid, so we used CDs. And the 2 CDs I remember using the most, we had a greatest hits CD from the band Chicago. And then there was an early CD from the gospel group Israel and New Breed. I wore those CDs out. And what I would do is I would put in my headphones, and I would close my eyes, and I'd sit at the drum set. And I would just listen. I got really good at listening for the drummer. What's he doing? What is he hitting? How is he doing it? And so for about 10 years, all my drumming was just me copying my dad and the drummers on these CDs. I didn't try to do anything on my own. I just would copy their brilliance. If they do it, I'm going to do it. And so I want to use this image this morning of a student learning to play an instrument, and especially learning with a teacher. I want to use this metaphor and this image to help us work our way through this passage. As Rachel said, we're in the book of 1 John, and we're going to be in chapter 2. This passage has incredible good news for us, but I think for a lot of us, when we initially hear it, myself included, we might not hear it as good news. We might actually kind of get a sinking feeling in our gut because it says over and over things like, obey, I command you to do this, follow this. You are commanded to do these things. And I think we will hear this negatively unless we learn to let Jesus teach us what true obedience means. So what we're going to do, we'll read the passage, we'll jump into it, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time sort of coming to Jesus like he's our teacher and our guide. We're going to let him diagnose what's wrong, why are we hearing this as bad news, and then hopefully learn to hear it as good news. So let's jump into the passage. We're in 1 John chapter 2, and we're going to start at verse 3. And I'll read the first part of the passage to begin this morning. We know that we have come to know him if we keep his commands. Whoever says, I know him, but does not do what he commands is a liar, and the truth is not in that person. But if anyone obeys his word, love for God is truly made complete in them. This is how we know we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did. Dear friends, I'm not writing you a new command, but an old one, which you have had since the beginning. This old command is the message you have heard. Yet I'm writing you a new command. Its truth is seen in him and in you, because the darkness is passing and the true light is already shining. Anyone who claims to be in the light but hates a brother or sister is still in the darkness. Anyone who loves their brother or sister lives in the light, and there is nothing in them to make them stumble. But anyone who hates a brother or sister is in the darkness and walks around in the darkness. They do not know where they are going because the darkness has blinded them. And I'm going to save the last part for the end. So right away, there's some major claims that have been made in this letter. If you remember back to the last few weeks when Mark was talking through chapter 1, you'll know that John comes out right away and says, hey, good news. God is love. Claim number one. This God is a loving God. He's a personal God. And then he says, you can know God. Good news number two. Now, our passage today, right up front, says, you can know God, and you can know that you know God. You don't have to worry about it. You can be assured. You can have assurance. But now the question becomes for most of us, okay, if I can know, how? How do I know? I suspect that a lot of us expect John to say something like this. You can know that you know God if you know the right things. Or maybe if you do the right things. Maybe if you have a killer devotional life. You read the right Bible plan. You work hard enough. You strive hard enough. If you do these things and you just try just hard enough, then you can be sure that you know God. You see, we have this temptation in us to strive and to be worried that we know God. Do we know God? Am I doing the right things? Do I know the right things? And so I want to talk about first, there's this first temptation in our lives. Mark hit on it, looking at chapter 1, and it's Gnosticism. It's this simple idea that there's special knowledge out in the world that if you know enough, if you're of a select group, you can get to know this special knowledge, and this special knowledge will gain you access to some goal. So it could be something like, I know the right things, and it gives me access to this special group of people. Or, I know the right things, and I've gotten in with the right group of people, therefore I get an in with God. It can take many forms, and it can seep into our faith if we're not careful. Our culture is Gnostic, not that differently from the culture that John was writing in the first century. We are a knowledge-based society. We prize intellectual knowing. People who know from the people that we trust, we lift them up. It's about who you know, how you know it, and where you got your knowledge. Just think about in our political discourse. If you listen to cable news or maybe you listen to political podcasts, people will often get split up based on what they know. So you'll hear people talk about there's the elites. They live on the coasts. And that's code word for they're highly educated. And then they'll talk about the people that are not elites, which they simply mean they're lesser educated. We split people up into these classes based off of what you know, who you know, and how you came to know it. Now, knowledge in itself is not bad. It's not bad in itself to be a knowledge-based society. But this can promote a performance-based lifestyle in us if we're not careful. I must do special things or know the right things or know the right people to get an in with God, or to know that I'm loved by God, or to know that I have an in with the right people. And so, when you look at this passage, most of us are going to hear it in this way naturally. We expect John to say, just do enough stuff, just perform enough, try hard enough, and then you'll know that you know God. But this is not what John says. John comes flat out and says, you can know God. You can know that you know God. And how do you know? It's if you live like Jesus. Now, if I had special effects, you would have just heard a car screeching to a halt. And in your mind, you're probably thinking, wait. This feels like a bait and switch. Didn't you just say performance-based faith is not what we're going for? And now you're telling me to live like Jesus. Wasn't Jesus perfect? Wasn't Jesus God? Didn't Jesus live a life of perfect obedience? How do you expect me to live like Jesus? And this is what I mean. We hear things in the New Testament over and over, like follow Jesus, live like him, obey his commands, become like him. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, deep down somewhere, we get a little worried, get a little afraid. I can't do that. I can't meet that standard. We secretly hear it as a list where we have to wake up in the morning and be like, okay, well, Jesus did this, and he did it this way, and so can I do that too? Or it's a standard that's always in front of our minds that we feel like we can never hit. And so we slowly feel like we just need to give up because I can't live like Jesus. We won't hear the good news of this passage, and in reality, the good news of the gospel, unless we let Jesus redefine what obedience means. Jesus lived a life of true obedience. And as one of my professors used to say, Jesus was the freest man who ever lived. But until we get that and understand what that means, will be afraid of the idea of obedience. Just listen to this from Jesus' own mouth. This is in the Gospel of John. He says, "Very truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees the Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son does also. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all he does." See, we hear that, and we feel like there's the Father over against the Son. Jesus is having to give up himself and be crushed by the Father. The Father's making him do things over against his will. We see it in this competitive framework where it's either God's will or it's my will. It's either the Father's will or Jesus' will. And what this shows is that in our lives, this is temptation number 2, we think that obedience is bad and freedom is good. We pit them against each other in our society. So if up front I said we live in a knowledge-based society, you could argue that even more so, we live in a society that prizes freedom and autonomy above anything else. We love the idea of freedom. And for most of us, freedom simply means I get to do what I want. Now, we all have responsibilities. We might have families, we have jobs we have to go to. We have to pay our bills, we have to mow our lawns. So we know it's not true total freedom, but we like the idea of waking up in the morning and having a sort of menu that says, okay, yes, I have to go to work, but I get to choose this. I want to be this type of person. I want to watch this. I want to date this type of person. We think of freedom as having choices. And this is our highest good. We think of freedom as being unencumbered. If I'm free, there's nothing restricting me from doing what I want. But if I have to obey, that's negative. That is, I'm being restricted. I'm being forced against my will, forced against my freedom. And we see this all around us in our culture. We prize individual behavioral freedom, and we resist anything that sounds like obedience or following commands. But this presents a problem because all throughout the New Testament, what do you hear? Obey, follow. You're commanded to do this. So what are we going to do with this seeming problem? I'm not the first person to point this out. People much smarter than me have said this already. But whether you agree with how I just described our culture and how they talk about freedom versus obedience, you do have to reckon with the fact that the way we typically approach freedom in our society and in our lives seems to be producing the opposite effect of what we want. We are some of the most anxious people who have ever lived. Gen Z's continually described as the anxious generation. We are highly addicted, and we have addictive behavioral patterns. And the Surgeon General recently came out after the pandemic and said we have a loneliness epidemic. Our freedom, or at least the ways we're thinking about freedom, seem to not be gaining us the desired outcome that we're wanting. When you encounter Jesus, you are forced to make some sort of decision. You cannot encounter him and walk away unchanged. You either have to say, I disagree with your vision of life, Jesus, or I'm going to let you work on me, reinterpret the ways that I'm seeing reality, the ways that I'm thinking about these certain categories. So that's what I want us to do today. I want us to take just a few moments and sit at the feet of Jesus as if we are a student learning an instrument. Say, Jesus, teach us. Show us how you see reality, and let's see if it helps us think about these things. So with Jesus, he flips everything on its head. Jesus reveals that obedience and freedom are not opposed to each other. To walk with Jesus is to walk in his kingdom. John Mark Comer, if you know who he is, he has a really interesting picture that can help us think through this, and this was very helpful to me. He said, following Jesus, living in his kingdom, is like a garment. Picture any type of garment. Picture a t-shirt, picture a blanket. And if you look closely enough, there is a grain where it was put together. There's a way that the stitching goes. And if you follow Jesus, if you live in his kingdom, you'll find yourself going with the grain. So if you run your fingers through any type of garment, if the threads are big enough, you'll notice that certain ways you move through it, you're going with the grain. It's easy. It almost takes your hand with you. But if you were to move your hand the opposite direction, you'll notice you're going against the grain. There's more effort required. You have to work harder. It'll be bumpier. And John Mark Comer says this can be somewhat of an image for what it's like to live with Jesus in his kingdom. When we let him show us the categories for reality, we begin to live in the grain of how he intends us to live. Here's a way that we can see this from a passage that I think is super familiar to all of us. Jesus says this, and we've seen it. It's on cards. It's on, Hobby Lobby. It's everywhere. He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now, we love this passage, and I love it too. But I think we're so used to it, we often pass right over the imagery Jesus uses. He says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." If anyone doesn't know what a yoke is, in an agricultural society, it's a device, either wooden or metal, that you would put over two animals. It would put them over their necks, and it would keep them side by side so that they can till the ground together. It keeps them going in the same direction. This image of a yoke is what Jesus says will give us rest. This is not our typical view of freedom. We think that when we follow Jesus, we should be free to do what we want, but Jesus says, no, take my yoke upon me, and then you will find rest. I am gentle, and I am humble in heart. You will not be weary if you take my yoke upon you. Freedom, as our society envisions it, is somewhat exhausting. Going your own way, trying to define yourself against other people, against other ideas, will lead to a life of striving and exhaustion in some way or the other. And Jesus says, I have a better way. Yoke yourself to me, and I will give you rest. This is where I think we need to slow down and listen to what Jesus says. The gospel is not do enough of the right things, and then I'll love you. Make enough of the right decisions. Believe enough of the right things, and then you'll be accepted, and then you'll be loved. Jesus says, obey me, and I'll lighten your load. I'll show you the way. Follow me. Listen to these freeing words of Jesus as he speaks them in the Gospel of John. And we can put these up on the screen. He says, a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. My command is this, love each other as I have loved you. This is my command, love each other. For this is the message you heard from the beginning. We should love one another. The important parts here are the ones that are underlined. As I have loved you, as I have loved you. This is the truth of the gospel. The gospel is not strive enough, work hard enough, and then maybe he'll love you, maybe he'll accept you. It's that you are already loved. And this is freeing. To obey Jesus is to not be crushed under his will. You do not have to give up everything you are, all of your dreams, all of your hopes, your will, your desire. You bring them to Jesus. He shows you the way, and he makes you more free. We are, in a sense, freed to love because he already loves us. Now, I want to reread the first part of our passage this morning and now see if we can flesh out some of these things and hopefully hear some of this as good news. So listen along as I read. We know that we have come to know him if we keep his commands. Whoever says, I know him, but does not do what he commands is a liar, and the truth is not in that person. But if anyone obeys his word, love for God is truly made complete in them. This is how we know we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did. Dear friends, I'm not writing you a new command, but an old one, which you have had since the beginning. This old command is the message you have heard. Yet I'm writing you a new command. Its truth is seen in him and in you, because the darkness is passing and the true light is already shining. Anyone who claims to be in the light but hates a brother or sister is still in the darkness. Anyone who loves their brother and sister lives in the light, and there is nothing in them to make them stumble. But anyone who hates a brother or sister is in the darkness and walks around in the darkness. They do not know where they are going because the darkness has blinded them. If there's one thing I want you to take away from today, it's just simply this. For John, knowing God is not an intellectual type of knowing. When he says you can know God, he's not saying you can know enough about him. You can know enough theology, philosophy. You can understand him at an intellectual level. To know God is to be known by God and to abide with him. Knowing this God who is love, who is relational, as John says, when you know him, all of a sudden you begin to have this realization. God already loves you. And so you are freed to love others because you are known and loved by this God. Just think about it this way. Is there someone in your life that you know knows you about as much as a human being can know you, and they love you? If there were to be someone who knew everything about you, your faults, all your good characteristics, all the decisions you've made, and you go over to their house and you spend time with them and you sit down with them, and they love you just for who you are. How do you feel in someone's presence like that? You're freed. You're freed to be yourself. You're freed to love. You're freed to be with them. You're not relating with them trying to gain their approval, trying to gain their acceptance. You are freed to be truly who you are and to let them truly be who they are. It is the most secure thing in any relationship to know that regardless of how broken you are, what decisions you've made, that person already loves you. And there's nothing you could do to change that love. This is at heart what the gospel says. God knows who you are. God knows who I am. He knows all the mistakes I've made, and he knows the mistakes I'm going to make. But that doesn't change the fact that he loves me, and he loves you. And that is what frees us to follow the commands we see in this passage. Think about it like this. The command to love others is outwardly focused. Martin Luther had this funny line where he said, God doesn't need your good works, but your neighbor does. And his point is not that God says to love because God needs your love. God is love, which simply means, as Christians have been saying for 2,000 years, God is a continual outflowing of love. We can love God, but God doesn't need it. And that's good news. God is not sitting around hoping you love him because it will make him have a better day, or maybe he'll accept you because you love him. He already simply loves you and will continue to love you. And this frees you to love other people because you already have God's acceptance. This is the secret to obedience to God. We're free to love because God doesn't need our love, but he gives the love we give back to us so we can give it to those around us. And it's in this way that we show that we are in him, because it's a self-completing cycle. We know God by living like Jesus, which means we love others, and we do so because we're already loved. And we bring that love back to God, and God sends us right back out to everyone else. Living a life of obedience brings about love in your life because God's life is love. Early on in the first few hundred years of the faith, theologians would often talk about the point of the Christian life is to become more like God. And this is what they meant. Our life is supposed to slowly look like the God of love as much as humanly possible. So as John will say at the end of this letter that we'll get to in a few weeks, he says, "Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another." And we're freed to do so. I want to close with this. There's a famous painting from a few hundred years ago. It's called The Banjo Lesson. It's by Henry Ossawa Tanner. And as you can see in this painting, the little boy is learning to play the banjo. And he's sitting with the master, sitting in his lap. The boy has his hand on the fretboard. He's figuring out how to pick. The master is holding him, and he also has his hand up on the fretboard, and he's showing him, do it like this, try this. You see, when I was learning to play the drums with my dad and then with some other people who taught me, in those first learning experiences, I was living a life of obedience. My dad was showing me what to do because I did not know what to do. I could have gone downstairs and sat at the drum set, picked up sticks, and just started banging on stuff. But I would have had no clue what I'm doing. I would have learned bad technique. I would have started thinking about it wrongly. And I might have still gotten to the point I am now, but it would have taken longer, it would have been harder, and I would have had to refix all of the mistakes I made because I didn't sit in obedience with someone who knew what they were doing. This is what obedience is. When we look at a painting like this one, we see that the teacher has delight in showing the student what to do. And the student has delight because he's learning without fear of consequence. The teacher knows he doesn't know what he's doing. And it's okay if he makes a mistake. When I was with my dad, I made plenty of mistakes. My dad expected them. But he continued to teach me and show me and wrap me in his love anyway. Obedience is simply resting in the Father's lap, letting him guide you in the ways of his kingdom. So let this be a picture of what it's like to obey Jesus, to be held by him, to be guided by him, and to do so freely without fear and without anxiety. I saved the last little part of our passage for last, and I'm going to end like this. John ends our passage with a poem. And I want you to notice how everything is written in the definitive. It's already true. It's already happened. This is true of you, so rest in this fact. He says, I am writing to you, dear children, because your sins have been forgiven on account of his name. I am writing to you, fathers, because you know him who is from the beginning. I am writing to you, young men, because you have overcome the evil one. I write to you, dear children, because you know the Father. I write to you, fathers, because you know him who is from the beginning. I write to you, young men, because you are strong, and the word of God lives in you, and you have overcome the evil one. We're going to move into a time of communion this morning. And as we do, as we partake of the elements together as a community, coming to the table where Jesus invites you to sit with him and feast with him, do so knowing that you are already loved by him. You don't have to gain his love and acceptance. You're invited to the table. You don't have to strive today. You can breathe out, breathe easy. And so this morning, I'm going to read our communion passage. And then I'll dismiss you. There's tables on either side. In a small jar, there are gluten-free crackers if you need them. So when you go to the table, go ahead and partake of the elements. And then you can come back to your seat, sit, and you can worship along with the band. So our passage today from Paul. For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And in the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant. In my blood, do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." You may go to the table.